So we're very happy to have Markus here, who is one of the initiators of this initiative, who will talk about the reversal interest rate today. And Markus, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Martin and Emmanuel, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to present this here. I joined to work with Jan Kobi, student of mine here at Princeton. And what we're interested here is essentially, given that we are interested in the negative interest rate policy, which is started in Denmark, Sweden, Japan, and Switzerland and the ECB, and we would like to understand how low can you essentially go, how negative can you go, because in particular there was a concern that going negative might erode the net interest income of all the banks. And here's just a quote from the Financial Times, that this is a concern generally which was raised at that time and was raised even last year, and it might erode the lending and transmission channel of monetary policy. If you look at the impact on the announcement of the negative interest rates on the stock prices, you see that in several countries there was actually quite a decline in the stock price of banks relative to the stock price of the overall index. So there's a lot of evidence, and I will come to the literature, that actually, if you go very low, and it need not be below zero, that actually profits of banks are suffering. And there's some papers here, and I will come to these papers in a minute. But they also, it might also impair then the lending of the banks. And here are some papers which are cited. I will come back to the literature review later. So what's the idea of the reversal interest rate? The idea of the reversal interest rate is that if you go below the reversal interest rate, actually what's typically an interest rate cut, which is typically accommodative, becomes contractionary. So it reverses its sign. And that's why we call it the reversal interest rate. And whenever you cut the interest rate, there are two effects, essentially. There's a capital gains effect. So in particular, if you have long fixed income assets, which have a fixed payoff, where the interest rate is locked in, you get immediately a capital gain. That's already in the I theory of money, what I work with Yuli. But in a world where the banks, there's imperfect competition among the banks, that the net interest income of the banks from new business is suffering. And then there's a balance between the capital gains and this new business income. So net interest income is suffering. So you have to balance these two forces. And it could be that the second force is larger than the first one. And under what we will highlight the circumstances when then actually cutting the interest rate is actually counterproductive. What's key? What are the key ingredients in this model? The two key ingredients. One is that we have the market power of banks. So banks make some positive profit. And that's because of imperfect pass-through. So if the policy rate, which we denote by I, imperfectly translates into some lending rate. So if there's a change in the policy rate, the change in the lending rate will be a different one, and there's a markup. So we will analyze this markup. And on the liability side of the banks, where they raise deposits, there's a markdown, and that's also different from the policy rate. Of course, it need not be always the case that there's a markdown. It can also go the other way around. We'll see this later on. So the first key ingredient of the model is that the banks have some market power. And the second key ingredient is that the financial frictions. And the financial frictions can be capital constraints or liquidity constraints. And I will come back to this, but they can either be regulatory constraints or there can be economic constraints coming from some principal agent setting, which we don't microfound here. We just take as given and see what are the implications of these financial frictions. So what we do essentially is first to identify where is the reversal interest rate, to get some idea whether such a reversal rate exists at all in the first place or not. And then we want to say, what determines the reversal interest rate? And we will determine, it depends very much how big the capital gains are induced by an interest rate cut and how the bank's profitability is affected by this. And also it depends on the initial capitalization of the banks. And then we will also show that if the capital constraints are tighter, so if you have very strict financial regulation, then actually the reversal interest rate will be higher. So you cannot cut the interest rate down so much. So there's an interconnection between monetary policy and financial regulation. And also if the banks pay a lot of dividends, then actually also it's the case that you cannot, your freedom of monetary policy to go down very low is actually reduced. Another result I would like to present essentially is that there's an optimal sequencing in terms of timing when do you want to do QE and when do you want to cut interest rates. What we are showing essentially is that you want to cut the interest rates down all the way to the reversal interest rate, and then only subsequently you do some QE. So you exhaust essentially first all the interest rate policy space before you do QE. The fourth point we would like to make is that if you go down to the reversal interest rate, the reversal rate essentially is creeping up over time. So over time is actually improving, is actually going up. So if you cut down, let's say to -1%, it doesn't stay down to -1%. It might come up to -0.5% and even further up. So you don't want to stay so low for too long, because it might be counterproductive. Even though initially it's productive to go to -1%, it might not be so productive to go subsequently so low. And I will show why a long-lasting low-rate environment might be harmful. And finally, what we will do is we put the whole thing in a New Keynesian DSGE framework, and we show that, okay, one driving force is that if you cut the policy rate, it doesn't translate into a one-to-one decline in the deposit rate, because there's imperfect pass-through, and that actually mutes the stimulative force typically you have through the Euler equation in the macro models. Even though there is a stimulative effect, so there's more, the reversal interest rate is lower in the general equilibrium setting compared to a partial equilibrium setting, it is not the case that, this force is muted because of this imperfect pass-through, and that's where the market power again comes in. And I will be very specific about that. Why? What we do essentially, we first show the whole thing in a partial equilibrium setting, show all the forces, and then we switch on all the demand effects and all the macro effects and put this whole thing in a DSGE framework and show that, even though in the DSGE framework, interest rate cut is more powerful, it does not eliminate this reversal interest rate. It's lower the reversal interest rate in general equilibrium, but it is, it's still there, and all the other results still hold.
Can I ask you a question, Markus?
Sure.
How the results depend on how competitive is the banking sector, both from a static and dynamic point of view?
So it depends quite a lot. So I will show there will be one parameter where we can actually adjust the competition between the banks, because if you have perfect competition, there's essentially perfect pass-through, and then actually an interest rate cut is more powerful. Okay, so to some extent. So you will see this in a minute. So, but the competition structure in the banking sector matters quite a bit.
But okay, but shouldn't then also study that from a dynamic point of view? For instance, in your creeping up results, shouldn't you incorporate that maybe if you affect the capitalization of banks, that will affect how they compete and so on? It's only a comment, but.
No, yes, that's correct. So I can go a little bit on the creeping up effect. So what's causing the creeping up effect is that actually, if you cut the interest rate, you have these capital gains, but the capital gains only last as long as the bonds haven't matured. So I will come back to this. So it will be clearer when I introduce the creeping up effect, what the intuition is behind that. And that's a little bit independent of the competition. Of course, the competition plays a role, but there's one effect which really drives the creeping up effect. And that's essentially depends on the maturity of the bonds on the bank's balance sheets.
Okay.
So I will essentially talk a little bit about the related literature, but then I will talk about the reversal interest rate in a very simple two-period model. Then it's a partial equilibrium setting. Then I will talk about the creeping up result. I put it in a three-period model just to keep it as simple as possible. And just show you the intuition for that. And then we put the whole thing in a New Keynesian DSGE framework where all the effects essentially switched on. So initially it's a partial equilibrium analysis where we have clean propositions showing the results, and then numerically we have the numeric results in the DSGE framework. And then we calibrate the whole thing. Of course, it's a calibration. So we get the number for the US for -1%. That's the reversal interest rate. But of course, we have to treat it with a certain sense of caution. Okay, related literature. So here's some related literature. There's of course much more, and it's an active field at the moment, and I'm hopefully haven't forgotten some papers among this audience. Of course, there are some papers which show that, the banks are only partially hedged against interest rate risk. So there's Beginau, Schneider, and Piazzesi have a paper showing that. There's some more recent papers showing this as well. And there's Landier, David Sreya, and so forth. They have a paper where they actually show that because of this partial hedge, it affects essentially banks' lending activity. So an interest rate cut will affect the bank's balance sheets, and that also affects the lending behavior. More recently, there is a paper by Drexler et al. It's a working paper, so they have a QJE paper which focuses very much on this non-competitive structure among the banks, and argues that when the interest rate goes down, then actually competition becomes more fierce. In their framework, it is because money comes in as a competitor, so the spread in net interest margins is actually shrinking as the interest rate comes down. What they show essentially is that the accounting net interest margin is relatively stable, or in the US at least, over a long horizon. So that's this red line here. I took this from their paper. The net interest margin, even though the Fed funds rate is moving up a lot, the return on assets is fairly stable. I call it the accounting net interest margin because it doesn't fully take into account whenever there's an interest rate cut, there is a capital gains, because if it's on the banking books, let's suppose you have some long-term bonds on the banking book, it will not immediately show up in their framework as a capital gain, so it might show up. You still get the high interest rate essentially for your long-term bonds in your banking book. And that of course smoothes things, and that's why I call it the accounting net interest margin. So the capital gains are smooth to the extent they're not materialized and to the extent that they're in the banking book. And their empirical analysis is also mostly for the normal times, even though it holds on to some extent to the extreme times, but we don't know how it would keep on going if you go to a Japanese lost decade framework. What the Teller and Kurlat are doing in similar way, so let me just say, so the intuition of Drexler et al. Is that banks have essentially a maturity mismatch, because whenever there's an interest rate cut, they're of course they're gaining from the interest rate cut, there's some capital gains, but on the other hand, they're losing because the market power of the banks is actually shrinking. So they're balancing these two forces essentially. So you would like to have some maturity mismatch as a bank, because your market power is moving with the interest rate. So as the interest rate goes down, you have less market power, so net interest margin, or the profit you make is actually shrinking. So you would like to offset that with some long-dated assets which secure your long income. Of course, not necessarily taking capital gains explicitly into account, just have this low, high interest income coming in over the subsequent months and years as well. The Teller and Kurlat also focus on this channel, but they, of course, they'll take the mark-to-market into account, so they are closer in this sense to our setting where it's fully mark-to-market, and there is some interest rate hedging as well, and their model give a particular model to illustrate that, and what utility function you need. You need risk aversion from larger of 1 in order to have this Newtonian dynamic hedging element coming in, and then you get similar features in their framework as well. There is a lot of literature saying that there's a nonlinearity in the net interest income or in equity in the interest rate movements. So that's some recent work here. First in English et al. And you have this paper some of you will be very familiar with. Then there's work from the ECB showing Altavilla et al. Showing primarily that low for too long is a problem in their framework. So they use a rich panel data set showing that. But they also show that going negative, at least for the euro area, was not a big problem. But they also emphasize, because it was accommodated also with LTRO and OMT, so other unconventional monetary policy measures, that's why going negative was not a big issue. And then I was just told that Gauti is presenting his DSGE New Keynesian framework with a negative interest rate policy. That's similar to ours. It's a little bit more reduced form, the way he models the banking system. So it's much more focused on the DSG framework. Ours has a DSG framework at the end, but it's more reduced form on the banking competition side. And I will be, we'll be focusing first on the partial equilibrium, showing this result, and then put it in the DSG framework only later on. So that's how much I would like to say about the literature. So let me now start with a simple two-period framework. It's a banking model a la Monty Klein, a traditional banking model. So there are only two periods. There's a continuum of identical banks with the following balance sheet. So you have loans. These are short-term loans with floating interest rates. They're granted at the interest rate IL. The policy rate is I. And then there is you can also have safe assets. Think of reserves or government bonds or any other assets which are fairly liquid. And essentially the yield you get is the interest rate, the policy interest rate. Okay? There might be some small spreads or something like that, but we don't take this into account in order to keep the notation simple. And then there's on the deposit side, you raise deposits, and on the equities, then you have some equity. There might be some wholesale funding as well, and the wholesale funding we assume are just netted with the safe assets. Okay, so there will be at the policy rate more. So the deposits are essentially from depositors, and you have some market power over these depositors. You also have some market power over these loans which you lend to some potential firms. In the G model, it will be firms you lend it to. The timing of the events is that initially there's an unexpected change in the interest rate. And then there's some capital gains from that. And then the bank is then subsequently, after this unexpected zero probability shock to the interest rate, is choosing how much it lends to the borrowers, at what rate, how many deposits it raises or issues, at what rate, and how many safe assets to hold. Okay, and then in the next period, the profits are realized. And the profits are realized affect, of course, also the equity or the net worth. So that the initial equity is E0 before the shock, and then there's an interest rate shock, and this will change the initial equity. And then there are also profits, and that's what we call then after equity plus the profits is the net worth of the bank. Okay, so let me just say some things a little bit more specifically about the rates you earn on this balance sheet. So one is the interest rate, the policy rate you earn on the safe assets. And you have these loans, and in the partial equilibrium setting, you just have some demand function for loans. So that's a particular demand function exogenously given as a function of the loan rate. And it has an elasticity of epsilon L. That's just exogenously given from the shape of this demand function. On the deposits, similarly, each bank is associated with a number of depositors with an intensive margin deposit supply. So that's how much each individual depositor says, should I save more or less depending on the deposit rate. It's, typically I would assume it's not so sensitive, but it has some elasticity of epsilon D. That's for an individual guy. And then it aggregates up to an aggregate number to all depositors in your bank. And here comes a new element we assume here. And the new element is here is that there's some, if your deposit rate is fairly close to the competitor's deposit rate, but then your depositors don't switch. There's some switching costs eta. Or more generally, what we think about this is that, if the deposit rate you're offering to your customers is, within a certain range, a certain activation spread threshold, but then you don't start searching around and go to competitor. But if it's above that, then you search around and then you move to your competitor, okay, potentially to somebody who offers a better deposit rate. Or put it differently, so if there's an indicator function here, if the difference between the policy rate and the deposit rate, which is this markdown, so how much you mark down, that's how much market power you exploit. If this is smaller than this activation ratio, then you just stay with your existing bank. If it's larger than the activation, then you search around and then you go to a better bank who offers a better deposit rate. Okay, and I will be more specific about that. Let me step back for a minute. There are two ways to model this. One way is to model this, and I will justify later on why we model it that way. Another way, which would also work in our setting, and that's what more Drexler et al., what they are doing, essentially is just cash comes in as a competitor. If the interest rate is going down, then, you know, instead of holding your money with a particular bank, you withdraw your money and park it in cash. In the latter framework, zero is unnatural because cash gives you no interest rate. Here it's very general. This eta can be anything which activates then you searching around. What we assume essentially is that this eta is a function of the policy rate. So if the policy rate is close to zero, your tendency to start searching is actually higher. That's what we assume. And if the policy rate goes negative, your tendency is also higher than that. So we calibrate this later on, this eta variable. And I have an extra slide on this, so I will be more specific on you know, where this eta is coming from. And if there are any questions, we should talk about that. So that's a critical parameter, especially later for the calibration. And then we have, of course, when you cut the policy rate, the initial equity might change because of capital gains. And the way we model this in this reduced form setting and two-period setting is just the change in initial equity. That's like a duration risk you have on your bank's balance sheet. Okay, the capital gains asset revaluation from an unexpected interest rate change. This could be on the safe assets, that's how we model it. It could also be on the loans. It could also reflect the fact that now your loans perhaps are less risky, and hence the value of the loans are going up. So it's essentially a revaluation on the asset side of the bank's balance sheet. We don't model explicitly risk-taking, so in a sense that this is a deterministic model. There's no default risk on the loan side, so it's not explicitly incorporated in the model. But
so, Markus, just a quick question. So you assume that the banks mark to market their balance sheet altogether?
That's correct. So in our setting, it's essentially everything is mark to market. Mm-hmm. So that's, yeah. Or implicitly, if they don't mark to market, what really matters for them is essentially the mark to market value. Yes. So they don't ignore this capital gains. So if you have no mark to market, you might just ignore it and this doesn't relax your constraint. In this setting, they mark to market and then they can relax the constraint. Let me give you, let's suppose banks were not mark to marketing, but they had this huge hidden capital gains on their balance sheet. If you hit your constraint, what you probably would do is you would sell some of these assets in order to realize these capital gains in order to relax your constraints. That's why we think it's probably more realistic to avoid hidden capital gains and just make them explicit by marking to market. Okay. So that's, you know, the basic balance sheet. But then we have financial frictions. As I mentioned before, we have these two financial frictions. In the two-period model, you essentially just need one of the two. In the G model, what's actually the liquidity constraint is important. So let me just go into these two financial frictions. The first one is the capital constraint. That's like a Basel capital requirement. You have certain loans you're granting, then you have a risk weight on these loans, and then you have essentially the net worth has to be larger than, you know, the loans times the risk weight. This could also be an agency problem, endogenous risk-taking behavior. Here we just take it as given. There could be due to regulatory reasons or to some agency problems. And then we have some liquidity constraint where we say the amount of safe assets you're holding has to be larger than a fraction of your deposits. There could be reserve requirements, liquidity requirements, you know, the new regulation we have implemented that you have to have enough liquid safe assets relative to the deposits. Or it could also be micro-founded with a potential bank run. If you have enough safe assets, then essentially you can defend a bank run very easily because, you know, at least 10% of the deposits are covered with safe assets. You can actually, a 10% bank run, you can fend off very easily. So that's a liquidity constraint requirement. So these are the two constraints we are imposing on the problem. So the bank's problem essentially then is the net worth at the end of the period is just the loans it grants, then it gets the interest rate on these loans, and it gets the loans paid back. And so it gets the interest rate of the loan rate. Then it has the safe assets. It gets the policy rate because safe assets adjust for that. That maximizes that. And then it has to pay for the deposits. It has to pay the deposit rate. Okay, and that's essentially the bank's balance sheet. So the loans plus the safe asset on the asset side is equal to deposits plus the equity. Of course, when the interest rate changes, the policy rate changes. This might, is affected as well. And then we have these two constraints. Okay, that's a capital constraint, and that's a liquidity constraint. So that's a bank's it's a simple problem. So, and you get the standard solution out of that, where the loan rate, the optimal loan rate, is essentially just the policy rate. That's the marginal opportunity cost. And what we assume here is that, you're a house bank. You essentially have some monopoly power over the guys some firms who want to borrow from you, and then you get this markup. That is the additional markup, one of the elasticity of the loans. And there's an additional component from some additional markup coming from the fact that your capital constraint might be binding. So this is under the assumption that the liquidity constraint does not bind. Okay. So that's essentially, that's a Lagrange multiplier on the capital constraint. And that's essentially, this was this guy, the risk weight on the loans. And similarly, you get this in a deposit rate, and you have this marginal benefit of raising a deposit, and then you have this markdown. The markdown depends again on the elasticity of the deposit supply from the depositors, from the households. And then there's also, like the same thing here, you have this liquidity constraint kicking in, where you have essentially Lagrange multiplier on the liquidity constraint. And this was our, this was the equivalent, the weight on the deposits, let's say 10%, or how many safe assets you have to hold. That shows this side D shows up here. Okay. But importantly, what you also have, the markdown is the minimum between this guy, or this would be including the minus, and the eta. So if you were to mark down further than eta, then actually these guys would surge around. And that's, I would like to talk a little bit more in the next slide about this eta, which is affecting what Alejandro was asking, the competition among the banks. So that limits the competition among the banks. So you think of it, you're essentially a monopolist up to a certain eta value, or monopsonist up to a certain eta value. But if you mark it down even further, this depositor will say, oh, now I switch to another bank. If I find another bank which offers a better deposit rate, a higher deposit rate. So that's essentially what this activation spread threshold eta, and that's related to the switching costs. Bill Sharp mentioned in '97, and there's more recent work on this as well. So essentially, as I mentioned before, if the deposit rate is below the policy rate minus this markdown, then say, oh, there's an outrageous low markdown on my bank, then I start searching. And the other assumption we make essentially is that this eta itself is a function of the policy rate. Okay, so if the policy rate is 3–4%, then people, if you can mark down much more easily than compared if the policy rate is around 0. Okay, because then people become much more interest rate sensitive. Said, oh, if now the interest rate moves down even further, I will switch to another bank. And so I'm referring for some empirical survey evidence. It's from IFO Institute. They have done some surveys on, and Heinz and others have conducted this surveys in Germany, and they asked, to what extent, when the interest rate went negative, what did you do? And what you can see is that, to a large extent, they negotiated with the bank. More than almost 50% negotiate with the bank for a higher, so they lowered the interest rate on the deposits. And they started negotiating, but many times the bank was very tough on it. And then they switched to another bank. So it changed to another bank, which did not yet charge negative interest rates. Very few increase the cash holding. That's another way to model it. So it's like, okay, I increase the cash holding, but of course, holding physical cash is actually not, so easy. It's also costly. And on the order, moved other things around. Of course, some of them increased some investment, but it's also not a big effect. But most of them essentially either negotiated with the bank for a better rate, or they switched to another bank, which charged not yet a negative interest rate. So this survey is conducted explicitly from switching to a negative interest rate and how firms reacted to that.
But Markus, related to this, I mean, most likely, at least I would presume that many of the banks in this, the firms in the survey have both depositor as well as borrowing, lending relationships with the same bank. Whereas in your model, I was actually going to ask this earlier, what do you assume on this?
So let me first say, I don't see it when you read the paper, they say a lot of firms, they all pay back their loan. Oh, yes, that's what they do here. They pay back loans. So they borrow from the bank and then they pocket with the bank. And many firms said, okay, now we pay back our loans. Okay, so that's also one response. So in our model, so what's a little bit misleading here is that these are the firms who react to that. In our model, it's households who are the depositors. Okay, so most of the deposits are coming from households, but we don't have any survey evidence how households behaved. And so my intuitive, I mean, you can probably give me some more feedback on that, is that in Germany, the households were not exposed to a negative deposit rate. Okay, so that for households, I think only one bank in Tegernsee, I forgot the Raiffeisen Bank, was going negative and made national news. Typically, the banks were very reluctant for small depositors or up to 100K to really go to negative interest rates, mostly for firms that went negative. So it just shows that it's very difficult for banks actually to charge negative interest rates for depositors. And here, the way we model this is very reduced form with this eta value. I think for firms, they can go to some extent, but even firms are very, try to avoid it. But if you were to go from 4% to, let's say, to 3.5%, probably nobody would, react so drastically. So the competition structure is changing dramatically if you go to around 0.
But sorry. Your decision to move funds to another bank might be related to the fact whether or not you have also a lending borrowing relationship with the same bank.
That's correct.
That you don't model that. In your model, households deposit and firms borrow. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So our full model doesn't have that effect that that firms deposit and borrow, because so essentially, I guess what's going on is they borrow long term and then they deposit and have some flexibility there. We have some working capital. The model is not rich enough to capture these details. So here's an example for Sweden. Essentially what's going on is that if you see the deposit rate, so the policy rate is this dark red line. And for corporations and even for households, essentially the deposit rate went to 0, but didn't go negative. Okay. I'll come back to Sweden because Sweden is special. I think the reversal interest rate in Sweden is lower than it is for the euro area, for example, because Sweden is very reliant on wholesale funding, and wholesale funding doesn't have this stickiness in the deposit rate. So wholesale funding can go down negative much more easily than deposit rates. Okay, so that's the case for Sweden. But it is the deposits themselves also are reluctant to go negative. Here are some numbers for the US. For the US, essentially what we have plotted here, that's from my student Jan Kobi, who is analyzing this in more detail. So what happens after you go negative, after you cut the interest rate, how long does it take essentially to get a reaction, how the pass-through in the money market rates. And here it says, okay, first the initial pass-through is only 20% in normal times, and it takes actually quite a long time for the pass-through, even in normal times, to go through. and then it's only partial, so it's only 0.4 or 0.35 essentially, even after 18 months. But you see, if you're in a lower interest rate environment, the impact is even lower. Okay, so the pass-through is even less pronounced. It's from 0 months again to 18 months. It always stays only 10% is actually passed through. So we will calibrate this, but the big assumption here essentially as we make is that if you go to a lower interest rate environment, then actually competition, people become more alert and the switching costs are essentially lower. And that's essentially our assumption that we make based on this evidence here. For us, it's an input to the model. Okay, so are there any questions about this eta, or? Because then the next step would be to say, okay, given this environment, what are the implications? When does a reversal rate exist, and what drives the reversal interest rate?
Markus, I have another question on ETA. So are you just assuming that they start searching for another bank, or they essentially immediately switch? So, I mean, is there some search and matching like?
Oh, we don't have an explicit model. They immediately switch in our framework. So they go to the bank that offers the best rate for them. Mm. Yes. So we don't have the whole search model framework for us. Yeah, we abstract away from it. Of course, one could put this into this framework. We haven't done that. So, so as you will see, so the two-period model is a fairly simple, transparent model. It doesn't have all the elements in it where we explicitly would model the search framework. But I don't think you would gain much from putting this in. But it might help in the calibration to some extent. So the first thing is, the first result essentially, does such a reversal interest rate exist? You know, can you go, if you go below the reversal interest rate, then actually the interest rate cap becomes contractionary. So that's what it says. So if your interest rate is below the reversal interest rate, but then another decline in the interest rate will actually lead to a decline in the loans. The contractionary mean it reduces the total amount of lending. Okay. So what we didn't do essentially is to have some welfare analysis and all this. For the first part now, I just look at, you know, if you cut the interest rate, will it lead to a lower amount of lending to the real economy? Okay, that's what we're asking in this simple framework. And what we're showing essentially, if the initial equity is sufficiently low of the bank, so if the bank's extremely well capitalized, then it might not exist. And if this change in the interest rate, so if the maturity mismatch on the bank's balance sheet is not too big, so the capital gains are not too big, but then there's such a reversal interest rate exists. Now, of course, it could be minus 5%, it could be minus 10%, okay, or it could be plus 1%, but it exists. But for these two conditions, so the banks are not so well capitalized, and the duration mismatch on the bank's balance sheet is not too pronounced. So what's the intuition for this result? It simply comes very simply from the envelope theorem. Essentially, when you cut the interest rate, you actually change the net interest income. What's your net interest income? It's the interest you make on your loans plus the interest you make on the safe assets. That's on the asset side. That's interest income on the asset side, and minus the interest rate expenses, what you pay on your deposits. If you're at the optimal point, but then actually, because of the envelope theorem, essentially this is optimized already. That's optimized. And all what matters essentially is the direct income you get on the safe assets. Okay, that's where the envelope theorem kicks in. So if you have a positive position on safe assets, if the interest rate goes down, your net interest income goes down as well. So it's a positive. This whole thing is equals to S. And if this S is positive, then this is also positive. So positive means you cut the interest rate, the net worth goes down. And if now your constraints are binding, the constraint becomes even more binding. And then essentially your lending goes down. Of course, there's an offsetting effect. The offsetting effect is if you have a duration risk on your balance sheet, so if you have highly long-term bonds on your bank's balance sheet, so if you cut the interest rate, then you make capital gains. So these are the capital gains showing up here. So it's always a balance between the net interest income and the capital gains you have on that. That's essentially, that's a horse race between these two forces, which then determine, you know, if this is much bigger than this force, then there's not an issue. If the maturity mismatch on the bank's balance sheet is sufficiently small, and this is sufficiently high, but then actually you have this interest rate, reversal interest rate active, and it exists. Okay. So the first thing is just pure existence result. The second result, now we want to show what determines this interest rate. So if you're a policymaker, what variables do you have to look at in the bank's balance sheets or whatever? You know, what do you look at as a policymaker? Say, how low can I go if the reversal interest rate exists? Is it -1%? Is it +1%? Is it -5%? What determines how can I quantify this to some extent? What are the drivers of the number of the reversal interest rate?
May I ask a short question?
Sure.
So from this proposition, like basically, if you would observe like an unexpected reduction in the policy rate, would you, if you would be below that I with the superscript RR, if you would go below that, would that be associated with the reduction in the market value of banks or not? Or is that difficult to say?
It would be, yes, it would be. So to the extent that the N1 is essentially market value of the banks, it would also come along with that.
Sure, thank you.
It would be one way to say, okay, how do the market value, of course you assume here market efficiency on behalf of the, but this would go hand in hand. Yes, it's correct. That's a good observation. So you might ask, you might start on balloon and say, okay, what happens if we lower the interest rate below this level and the stock markets tank? Then you might say, oh, I have to be a little bit careful as a policymaker to go that low.
Okay,
let me give you the main insight, essentially what's going on. So if, as long as the capital constraint is slack, so essentially this capital constraint is not binding, so it's slack, so we are not at the capital constraint, that's another indication that, you know, you can go lower because, you know, you cut the interest rate here and the lending rate is going down, and as the lending rate goes down, you give more loans, so that's negative here, and because you give more loans, actually net worth is actually going up, so yeah, you give more loans and net worth is going up. But when the capital constraint binds, then this equation holds, this constraint binds with equality. Then coming to your intuition about, as you cut the policy rate, the net worth is going down, and then so because of this constraint, essentially you have a decline in interest rate, decline in net worth, will then also translates into decline in loans. Okay, so that's why this is then positive, and that's when, as soon as the capital constraint starts binding, but then cutting the interest rate further down is actually then counterproductive. Okay, and that you might argue that the net worth you might be able, or you have a proxy in the stock price, might be a proxy you can see there already. And of course, what's happening if you cut the net worth, there's some implicit amplification here in this, and that's reflecting by this amplification operator, this Gauss multiplier here, that if you have fewer loans, also you make less profit on that, that brings the net worth down again and so forth. But essentially, the reversal interest rate is actually not effective if the capital constraint doesn't bind, but once it starts binding in this two-period model, but then actually the reversal interest rate kicks in. So this constraint is key in order for this reversal interest rate to really have some bind. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, now let's do some comparative static and say what drives, what are the determinants of this reversal interest rate. So as I said earlier, so the initial equity matters a lot. And let me split up the initial equity into some constant plus the capital gains I get from the interest rate cut. Okay, so there's a little E0 bar, and then there's some capital gains from the interest rate cut. Because you can have a high interest, you can have initially well-capitalized banks, or you can have a big maturity mismatch on the bank's balance sheet, makes the bank equity react a lot to that. The first thing is, of course, if the banks are well capitalized, the reversal interest rate is lower, so it can go down further. So there's much more room to go down. So in Sweden, I think the banks were fairly well capitalized, so you could go down further. And it's also the case if you have more maturity mismatch, which means, you know, if the interest rate goes down, you have capital gains, so this will be more negative, then you can also go more negative. Or put it differently, if this is increasing in the sensitivity of the capital gains with respect to an interest rate cut. So that's a negative of a maturity mismatch. We did this in a way that we're holding the overall equity is fixed, and we are in the range where, you know, above the reversal interest rate. So that's essentially, if you have more maturity mismatch on the bank's balance sheets, or if the banks hold more long-dated assets, then actually you can go down further. And this will be related also to the creeping up effect. So this will be key in understanding the creeping up effect as well. The next competitive static is, so here assume that the banks pay out part of the capital gains they're making. That's the payout rate chi 0. That's, we assume, a fixed payout rate. So if you have a certain profit, you pay out some fraction of it to the shareholders. And if there's a higher payout rate, but then actually, you know, the reversal rate is higher. So if the banks pay out, like in 2007, where in the US, the banks paid out a lot of their profits, it might be to a large extent to capital gains from interest rate cuts, then, you know, then actually an interest cut is less effective. You don't want to go down so much. The third result is essentially if the capital regulation is tighter or the liquidity regulation is tighter. So these were our two regulatory risk weights or regulatory coefficients, then the interest reversal rate is actually higher. So you have less room to do monetary policy. So there's a clear interaction between the regulation and the monetary policy. And that's where Alejandro's question comes in. Essentially that's the market power playing a role here. If there's more market power, then actually you can put the reverse rate down further. That's a little bit connected. More market power means that the banks, so it's a level of market power. It's not sensitivity of the market power as it changes with I, but the level of market power. It means essentially banks are making more profits because you have more market power. That actually is similar to an initial equity, high equity position, and hence you can go down further in the reverse emphasis. So if you have a very competitive banking system, and in level terms, and the banks don't make much profits, but then actually you have less room of going down much further into negative territory.
Markus, I have a question concerning the determinants of the reversal rate. So in your model, you have a capital constraint. I mean, that is not a collateral constraint, but is some sort of constraint on net worth. So I was thinking, if you put a collateral constraint, and in particular, if the assets on that collateral constraint negatively depend on the policy rate, could you have maybe multiple reversal rates or not?
So can you elaborate that sense? How would your collateral constraint look like? Or you have?
Yes, I would put, let's say, on the right-hand side, the price of some assets that negatively depend on the policy rate. Let's say, and hence, when you reduce the policy rate, you increase the right-hand side on that constraint, making it less binding in some sense.
More so, binding. Or if you increase or decrease the policy rate?
Decrease.
Oh, decrease, okay. Yes, you make it less, but that's what we try to capture with the capital gains. So you can think of the safe assets. So we didn't include the loans but to some extent, let me go back to the balance sheet. So these loans and the safe assets save as a collateral or serve as a collateral. When we cut the policy rate, we don't do much on that side because we assume the loans are essentially repriced, so they are LIBOR plus something. So, but you could generalize it and also make the loans long dated, or saying it will affect the recovery value if there's a default on these loans, which we have not incorporated in the model. Then actually it will translate. So to the extent that the safe assets save as a collateral. So if you had, so what you have in mind is that we have an additional collateral constraint.
Yep.
Yes. So Yes, we haven't analyzed that. So you can have on top of this capital constraint, you have a collateral constraint on top of it. And if you cut the policy rate, you increase the value of the safe assets and you relax the collateral constraint. So this
whatever assets they use as collateral, let's say. Yes.
Say again? Sorry?
Or whatever assets these guys use as collateral. It could be safe asset or a loan, as you mentioned before.
Yes. I mean, to some extent, I can very broadly interpret, I can interpret this a little bit as a collateral constraint too, but there's no safe asset. So, but in the paper we say, oh, plus S, but then we put a zero risk weight on this. Yes. No, we could do that. So let me put it this way. If there's a third financial friction, which is a collateral constraint, then you could actually relax the collateral constraint. And to the extent you don't affect this one, it's a good thing. Okay, so let's suppose the collateral constraint is binding, but the capital constraint is not, then an interest rate cut is a good thing, so you would be definitely above the reversal rate. Does this answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Now think a situation that maybe in that model you can have multiple reversal rates, I don't know, in some sense. Depending on the binding status of each constraint, whatever, but it's kind of different for the other.
Yes, so depending on the parameters, there will be, I'm not sure whether there's, so what you have in mind, so there's always a one rate when if you cut the policy rate below that, lending is going down. But by multiple, you mean there's some reversal, then you go down, then it becomes enhancing again, and then becomes negative again. So haven't really thought about this. So if you introduce now an additional constraint, it could be that there's some, instead of having these two regions, you have, 4 regions.
No, definitely, because yes, because this is related in the way you characterize the solution. Yes, you have, let's say, kind of a threshold rule, meaning that if the rate is below
That's correct, yes.
But maybe you have multiple thresholds, just to put it in that way.
Yes. So if I may draw, I don't know, can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can see that.
So I draw here the interest rate. So it could be that, first it is, if I cut the policy rate, it's accommodative, and then there's a smaller range where it becomes contractionary, but then if you cut it further, it becomes accommodative again, and then it becomes contractionary again. So then, yes. So if I introduce more constraints, then this actually can happen. We haven't thought about this. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it's only a comment. Yeah. Okay,
good. Any other questions at this point? Or I'm doing with the time. Oops, I'm running really late. Okay. Sorry, what's my time limit?
I think it's till Martin. We started late, right?
Let me not.
Yes, so we started a little bit late. So I think
10 more minutes.
10 or 15 more minutes.
I will speed up. So the optimal sequencing of the QE, essentially, here's the intuition. The intuition essentially is that if I do QE, essentially I take long-dated assets out of the bank's balance sheet. So typically what I do is by doing QE, I take long-dated assets with long maturity from the bank's balance sheet and replace it with short-dated reserves. Now that's essentially what QE does, or to the extent it does it. And that means the bank's duration mismatch is actually going down, and I need this duration mismatch in order to generate capital gains from an interest rate cut. Okay, so I don't want to do that. So I just want to first cut the interest rate in order as much as I can, because that actually recapitalizes the banks through the duration mismatch. If I do QE, I reduce the duration mismatch in the bank's balance sheet, and then my reversal rate is moving up, so I cannot cut down the interest rate so much. So what I want to do first is I go exhaust all my interest rate cuts all the way down to the reversal interest rate, and then I can do QE subsequently, where I take the long-dated assets out of the bank's balance sheets and replace it with short-term reserves. Now let me talk about the creeping up result. So here's the intuition for the creeping up result. So what we said before is that there's two forces we have to balance. One is if you cut the interest rate, you actually hurt the banks by reducing their net interest income, okay? Because you give them less money on the safe assets and you make less profit from that. So for new business, the net interest income is actually going down. And if you dive in a multi-period framework, I just picked 4 periods. Later, I will only have 2 periods. In the first period, it's negative. I cut interest rates, let's say, to forward guidance for 4 periods. And as I cut the interest rate, so it goes down, net interest income goes down, net interest income goes down, and so forth for 4 periods. But the benefit from capital gains depends, of course, how long the bonds are lasting. So if the bonds are only lasting, let's say, for 2 periods, because afterwards they expire, the positive effect only lasts for 2 periods. And in period 3, the bonds have matured, and the new bonds will be repriced, so they are issued at the new price. So I don't have this benefit anymore, the capital gains benefit anymore. So I have the cost, the negative effect I have for 4 periods. I do 4 periods negative forward guidance, the interest rate will be low for 4 periods. But the capital gains I only have essentially only for 2 periods. So you can see while the interest rate, the reversal rate is actually lower for up to 2 periods, then it will creep up as the benefit of the capital gains evaporates, the interest rate will go up. So let me just show this formally. So what we do it is in a 3-period model in the paper. So it's the simplest way you can do that. So initial equity is this, you have this baseline equity. Then you, if I make an interest rate cut from period 0 to 1, and then a forward guidance from period 1 to 2, but then I have capital gains on the short-term bond from 0 to 1, and I have capital gains from the 2-period bond from 0 to 1 and 1 to 2. So if I lower here and lower here, there will be capital gains coming from that. But let's now assume there's a certain dividend payment. So a certain fraction of dividend of the net worth is paid out in terms of dividends. And what one can show, and I just show, given the time constraint, I will just mention the proposition here. If the initial bond holdings are not too big, then the loan maximizing interest rate is actually creeping up. So if you want to say, I want to set today's interest rate and then the next period's interest rate in such a way that in order to maximize total lending from today and total lending tomorrow, given some discount factor from the planner's perspective, actually the interest rate is actually creeping up. Okay, why is that? Because, so the reverse interest rate is creeping up because initially when I cut interest rates, I will have benefits on all the bonds that make capital gains. But the bond which matures, the capital gains comes only for this 1 period. And if I say I do for the next 10 periods, let's say, I cut the interest rates, the 1-period bond is not benefiting from that. Okay, it's only the 10-period bond, but if most bonds are short-term, actually the benefit of the capital gains is actually evaporating or is fading out over time, while the cost of a low interest rate environment of lowering the net interest income is not fading out. Okay, that's as you go through time, as you do forward guidance for longer and longer, actually the force of the negative force of the net interest income is actually persisting, while the force of the capital gains is actually fading out. And that's why the reverse interest rate creeps up over time.
Okay, we are back. Good.
Okay, so let me move now quickly to the DSGE model. So what we do is now we put the whole thing in a DSGE framework, because you might say, so far it's very much a banking model. There's no price stickiness, there's no aggregate demand effect and all these things. And how will this play out? And all on top of it, you can't even calibrate it and can't give me a number. And policymakers want a number. So I can give you a number at the end of the day, but of course there's a huge standard error around it. But the main insight essentially is that the reverse interest rate in general equilibrium, because of this demand effects and all the other effects, will be lower than in the partial equilibrium. In the general equilibrium for the US, we calibrated to about -1%. So here's the DSGE model. The banks, as we had before, they have some markups, markdowns. There are some workers, savers, households that do all of this. We will come to that. They own the banks. And then there will be 2 types of producers. There will be retailers or final goods producers, and there will be intermediate goods producers. The intermediate goods producers, they borrow from the banks. And there will also be the government, the central bank, setting the policy rate. Okay. So here, let me just walk you through the main players in this DSGE framework. They're consumers. They have some habit formation from the previous consumption level. They're workers. They're consumers. They're workers, so they earn wages. The owners of firms, of all the firms, because there's monopolistic competition. The firms make some profit. They also get the dividends from that. And they also own the banks, okay? And then there's savers. The households are also savers, so they get the interest rate, the deposit rate. And there will be different type of firms. There will be firms which can only fund themselves through the banks. And there will be also firms which can fund themselves from the households directly. So they can also lend to the bank independent firms, okay? And all what they're lending essentially is at the deposit rate. Okay? That's essentially what's going on, because that's set essentially in this banking environment. Then there are banks. So as I mentioned before, what's key is now more than even before is that the pass-through is dampened. So if you cut the policy rate, the deposit rate will not go through 1-for-1. Okay? And the reason is this eta function, as you get closer to 0 or even negative, the eta function is actually becomes more and more sensitive. So there's market competition, they can't pass it through. So the markdown is actually shrinking over time. So you can do this either through this eta function, as I mentioned before, or you can also do it in a way where you would say, oh, there's actually competition coming in from cash. So if the interest rate goes closer to 0 or even negative, you don't want to hold so many deposits, you just park it in physical cash, and that's what dries up funding for the banks. What we do in order to calibrate this, so the whole aspect is calibrated to the US. For going negative, we actually rely on Euro area data. And that's the functional form we assume here. So this eta function takes this functional form, and we just calibrate it to the pass-through numbers we have for the US. And for very low numbers, we calibrate these parameters eta 1 and eta 2 such that they also fit to the European numbers. Now, in terms of the banks, what are their constraints? So they pay out a fixed dividend payout rate per period. So that's the chi. That's a constant number. So we don't explicitly model dividend payouts. We just assume they pay out a fixed fraction of the net worth to the dividend, to the shareholders as in form of a dividend. And instead of having the fixed constraints, this capital constraint, the liquidity constraints, we have this quadratic functions. So there's relative to net worth, this was our constraint. So this was the risk weight times the loans divided by the net worth now minus 1. There's a quadratic cost function. So we have quadratic cost rather than this absolute constraint which we had in the 2-period model. And we calibrate this. This is the cost 0.28 from the data as well. And we match essentially the shareholding of safe assets to deposits, the steady state level from the average, what we observe in the data. And we also say how that's the maturity mismatch of the bank's balance sheet. So if you cut the interest rate, how much does the equity position change? So how sensitive is it? And we take the steady state equity holding plus a linear form of the interest rate policy. And then we say, oh, what is the zeta from the data? Again, calibrated from the data we get from the call reports and the Fed flow of funds and so forth. In terms of the firms, as I mentioned, there are 2 types of firms. They're the intermediate goods producers. They have standard Cobb-Douglas production function, but the decreasing returns to scale with this nu being 0.81. They have quadratic adjustment cost functions. And importantly, for the US, we assume that 41% of the firms are bank dependent and 59% are bank independent. Of course, the bank-dependent firms in the model will be smaller because there's an intensive margin adjustment, and the bank-independent firms, they can borrow essentially outside of the banking system. They will be bigger because they get cheaper funding. So total funding is like in the data is 19%. So 19% is funded through the banks, and 81% is funded outside of the banks. For Europe, this would be different. So we also calibrate to the European numbers. It has some impact on the reverse interest rate, as you can imagine, but it's smaller than what we have anticipated. So 1 minus C of the borrow, they can borrow from the households directly. And the final goods producers, we just put in because we need this for this monopolistic competition in order to have stickiness. We don't do Calvert, do Rottenberg price rigidities. Now let me just say the thought experiment we do. So we have a Taylor rule. The steady state interest rate is about 2.12%. And then what we do is saying, okay, let's have a monetary policy shock, which would actually move the interest rate away from the steady state from 2.212%, let's say down 1% to 1.12%. And then what happens if we had another shock? Would that be counterproductive or not? Okay, there's another shock. So there's an initial shock, monetary policy shock, and then we move another marginal shock. Would this be counterproductive? So it's like first we move down by 1%, then we have this shock, and then let's move again, or we move it down by 2%, the initial shock, then we actually around 0, then go negative, or we move it down by 4%, and then we move it a little bit further, another marginal shock. And what we're looking at is this marginal impulse response curves due to a further monetary policy shock by, you know, a quarter of the sigma. So that's essentially what we're doing. That's our thought experiment. You have the initial steady state. Of course, at the steady state, if you do a marginal change, then nothing, it's never reversible. But you have an initial shock, so price shock, let's say extreme of 4%, then you will be at minus 1.88%. And now I move it a little bit further. And what is this little bit further doing? Will it actually be contractionary or will it be accommodative? Okay. And everything is a nonlinear perfect foresight solution. So there's no uncertainty besides this zero probability shock coming from these monetary policy shocks. So here you see the marginal impact after. So if you're at the steady state, so there was initially no shock, and now you do a small shock around this, what is the effect? On the deposit rate, perhaps let me move directly to consumption. Consumption is moving up, okay? And the capital is moving up. So, it is the case that actually an interest rate cut at the steady state is very accommodative. It's very enhancing, so it's a good thing to have. And it's also accommodative after initial minus 1% shock or initial minus 2% shock. So it's still accommodative, so it still leads to more consumption in both cases. But if you're away from this 2.12% and you already have an initial shock rate at minus 1.8%, and then you would go even further, then actually what is typically accommodative becomes contractionary, okay? And it's lasting. So this is annually. So I should have said we have a Taylor rule, but we only shock for 1 year, we shock the interest rate, and then you go back to the old level. Okay? So in order to switch off all this forward guidance puzzle phenomena and all this. So it's only for 1 year, you lower the interest rate, and then you go back to the other old interest rate framework. But what you can see is that if you're at minus 0.88, and then you shock it a little bit further, then actually what's happening is actually consumption is contracting, and for a long time until it comes back, and it's not even coming back fully, and capital is contracting, so it becomes contractionary, like what the partial equilibrium model was showing, but now everything included in this whole full GE model, all the income effects and everything is taken care of in affecting all the decisions of all the various players in the economy.
But so Markus, just a quick, so the initial, to understand, to make sure I understand this right, the initial cut to by minus 4% is still accommodative. It's just the additional further cut then, which is not, or maybe I misunderstood.
Yes, you can view this, but essentially there's some shock. So you can have a net worth shock, or there's some other shock which throws you off the steady state. Okay. And that's where you are at the moment. So it doesn't need to be a monetary policy shock. It can be some other shock. And then the question is, should I cut the interest rate further or not?
Okay.
So you have a steady state of 2-point-something%, and you're at minus 1.88 because you did already some accommodative, or you did something, or there were some shocks which led you to this point. And now you ask yourself, should I go further or not?
And then the answer is no, but initially
but you should not go to minus 1.88 or whatever this thing is.
Okay.
So of course, I should say we calibrated this it's a calibrated model, no? So let me just be self-critical. So what is missing in this framework, of course, we have the firms as the borrowers from the banks, and we have the households as depositors. We don't have mortgages in the model. So we don't know what happens. Let's put mortgages in, how sensitive would the calibration be, and things like that. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. It's more a proof of concept, saying, oh, does it work in the full DSG model, a standard DSG model? But we have not put the whole mortgage market in. That's one thing one could do, and many other things one can refine things. Some people say, oh, what's about the insurance sector? You've only the banking sector. Put in the insurance sector. But that's, of course, at least we try to put a serious banking sector into this framework.
Markus, may I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So you have some sort of policy rule here, or what would happen, you know, here in this framework here? Suppose that you're close to the reversal rate, and you know you get a. Then we know that, you know, if you do like a contraction or cut in the policy rate, expansion of monetary policy in a sense, you know, that could be contractionary to the economy. But what happens if you have, you know, say a more aggressive monetary policy rule? What role does the systematic policy rule coefficient play in this framework when you have a bad, say, fundamental shock to the economy?
So you're asking, so in terms of Taylor rule, what we're doing essentially, we're lowering the interest rate for 1 year, and then we go fully back. So there's persistence, full persistence for 1 year, and then you go back to the old steady state. Okay. So so the complication which comes in, and we don't have much to say about the forward guidance puzzle. If you have a very persistent, let's suppose you cut the policy rate, and through the Taylor rule it stays low for very long. Okay, then you have the forwards guidance puzzle, which will be more accommodative in a sense. But we don't believe in this forward guidance puzzle phenomenon. So that's why we go only for 1 year cut. So we don't go for a quarterly model, but for an annual model, there's perfect persistence for 1 year. And then we go back to the normal level of interest rate.
Right. So
if you have, let me just say it again, if you had a very persistent rule, then the forward premium guidance puzzle, the forward guidance puzzle would actually make it more accommodative. It would work against us. Okay. But so that's another thing which we don't know 100% if there is any feedback on that dimension, how to handle the forward guidance puzzle phenomenon in this framework, because it also pushes us in one direction, probably too powerful in the direction of being accommodative. I should also say something about the Taylor principle. The Taylor principle can also be applied in various ways, because the way that if you cut the policy rate, it does not translate into a one-to-one change in the interest rate the households are getting. So does the Taylor principle apply to the deposit rate or to the policy rate? That's another choice, you know, we were struggling with what to do on that. So we decided at the end to do for this one perfect persistence for one period, interest rate cut, and then go back to the normal levels, rather than, you know, playing around with different Taylor principles, because it's not clear whether you want to apply to the policy rate or to the deposit rate. And you can see with imperfect pass-through, you know, the Taylor principle, if you apply it to the deposit rate, is way stronger than it is if you apply it to the policy rate. I don't know whether the literature has thought about this.
Markus, I have a related question. So in your model, you only have one policy rate, no? It's not that you can target independently the interest rate on reserves from the deposit rate, no?
That's correct. So you only have the policy rate, but you know that the policy rate will translate into a certain deposit rate. And for the Euler equation of the households, what matters is the deposit rate, not the policy rate. So you could say, let me put it this way, let's suppose that the pass-through is only 50%, but then if I apply the Taylor rule, I have to be twice as powerful in order to still for the deposit rate to hold for the Taylor principle.
Yes.
So because whenever I change the policy rate, I have to be, you know, and then of course when the inflation comes up again, then I have to react very, very powerfully because it doesn't translate. The pass-through is limited. It's only half as much as the policy rate. I have to increase the interest rate a lot in order to get the deposit rates up.
I see. And I had a question. So do you have an estimate of what is the interest rate reversal in a true economy, let's say in the US or in Europe?
Yes.
Because I think maybe
the estimate is so if you calibrate the whole thing, we get -1%.
Oh.
A little bit less than -1%. Of course, that's for the US, and it is for this huge, bank independent financial firm sector. So for the Europe, it's different. That's your question?
Yes. I was just curious if your theory has to say something about that, but of course, but
No, but you have to treat this with a caution. No, it's not really because it depends on many modeling elements of where you get this number. So it turned out more robust, this -1%, than we actually thought, because it depends a lot on this eta function and the fact that if you go close to 0 or even negative, this is very powerful. And it depends less on how big the bank dependent versus the bank independent sector is. But yeah.
I mean, this reminds me that literature that wants to measure the natural rate of interest in the economy. So there are kind of two approaches. One is VAR, the other one is DSGE. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, kind of the conclusion is similar in the sense that the estimate is very dependent on modeling assumptions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so in this sense, yes, that's a good analogy. I will put equally much weight on the estimates of the R star to this. So but I think what's important is, of course, if you go in the cross-section across countries, you can say, oh, this country is much more wholesale funding dependent, or that country, the banks have a lot of maturity mismatch. And you can get some sense, where you can go more aggressively negative or less aggressively negative, or what variables to look at. So you see in some other country where they went negative and went okay, and then you say, oh, and our banks even have more maturity mismatch, then you might feel more emboldened to go even more negative. Or you say our banks are much less wholesale funding reliant and they can't pass it on to the depositors, and our banks have less maturity mismatch, so you might be more cautious. So I'm talking now from a policymaker's perspective. Or you can rely on this DSG model, but there's of course a lot of assumptions put into this DSG model.
Okay.
Should I think it's probably, I don't have to repeat in the conclusion given the time constraints. So if there are any further, so in particular for the DSG model, which I was rushing through at the end, how would be great to get some feedback from you guys. We move to an annual model essentially, and then we cut the interest rate for 1 year, and then we go back. That's essentially the experiment we are doing. We also said, okay, let's first do a monetary policy shock, which brings us to this bad outcome, and then we say, should we cut the interest rate even further? And the monetary policy shock, the way we do it is essentially we shock the epsilon in the Taylor rule such that the initial interest rate cut, let's say, is 4%. We have this epsilon we need for that. Then we say, oh, let's shock the epsilon a little bit further. Is this extra thing, is this accommodative or not? Is this, a process, or this marginal impulse response functions, is this the best way to illustrate it? Or would you feel more comfortable saying that the initial shock has to be a net worth shock by the banks, or has to be some other shocks? We can work with other shocks as well. So that's where I think where feedback would be highly appreciated. So let me just run over this. So we showed the existence of the reverse interest rate. There are always these two forces, the net interest income and the capital gains in the banking model, where there's no aggregate demand and all the other effects active. What determines it? Regulatory constraints. If there are tight regulatory constraints, you have less room in monetary policy. A little bit like you put the brakes on with regulatory constraints, and then you want to put the accelerator on with monetary policy. This doesn't really work. So you have to consider this in harmony of each other. Dividend policies are bad. If the banks are not well capitalized, you cannot move down so much. If the banks are less profitable, you cannot move down so much. In terms of sequencing between QE and interest rate policy, you want to exhaust all the interest rate policy before you go move to QE, because QE essentially takes long-dated assets out of the bank's balance sheet and makes then interest rate cuts less powerful. Then we have this creeping up effect, where we're saying that you can go down right now, but not for too long, because over time, as the bonds mature, the capital gains effect is dying out, is fading out, while the negative net interest income effect is staying there. So you can go much further down now, but you can't stay down for too long. And the imperfect pass-through is key, also to work for the DSGE model. And so the number we got roughly for the US is -1% in this context.
So I have a comment, Markus. I know this is very useful, but I think that in terms of motivation, your project will be much more powerful if somehow you show that nowadays, let's say, Europe and US is very close to a reversal rate. So if you somehow can estimate that guy and claim that maybe we are now at that level, or maybe eventually in future we'll be close to that level, then I know as a consequence, independently of how you show the real effects of your accommodative monetary policy, I mean, people will think that it's something worth considering. I mean,
yeah, so I'm a little bit more careful in terms of how much weight I put on this -1%. No, it's.
No, yes, but I mean, you can always do some robustness, whatever. I know that's feasible, just to be, let's say,
yes,
pragmatic on what is the true value of that guy, man.
But it's the same thing as with our star, and essentially, these are noisy estimates in a sense. While I think the comparative static is very, I would hang my head on it very much more confidently and say, okay, that's really, that's something I can stand 100% behind it. The 1%, I don't know, it might be -1.5 or -2%, depending what you put in the DSGE model and how, when you can do thousands of robustness checks on that.
Okay, then.
But so that would also mean that sorry,
Emmanuel.
That would also mean that you would put more weight on the cross-country comparison of your calibration, because that's a little bit like your comparative static. So in a more bank-based system like Europe, this rate would be.
So we looked at by doing a comparative static with respect to the bank-based system, and we thought, oh, we would get for Europe a very different number, but it didn't turn out so different, so we were surprised. Okay, so the DSGE model, by changing only how many firms are bank dependent, we got roughly the same, not -1%, but perhaps -0.8 or something.
What if you change the competition structure of deposits? I mean, probably that has to affect or not.
Yeah, so we haven't 100% figured out why this was not more powerful, in a sense that. What our intuition said us is, because what's important is this eta, as you go towards zero, a little bit negative, the competition becomes very sensitive. That's already in the US, and it's in the US, we assume the same eta function. So the number of bank-dependent firms made some difference, but not this huge difference. I would have expected it makes a huge difference. It did not make such a huge difference.
But if I understood, sorry. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's.
I was just so you assume that households lend to banks at the deposit rate as well, right?
That's correct.
So
of course, what we don't have, so other things which are missing in the model, we don't have default. There's no credit spread or anything like this on it. Yes, so if we were to the other thing is, you might say, oh, okay, individual firms don't have the power to raise funds from the deposit rate, then of course, households would only lend most of their resources directly to the firms, to the bank independent firms. That might be too radical as well, and that's something we can think through, but there's probably there's a middle way, which is the right way to capture But
as long as you assume that, then the bank dependence doesn't matter so much, right? Because the firms can always essentially switch to borrowing from households. Or is my intuition wrong here?
So here what we assume, the bank independent firms, they can always borrow from households at ID, at the same rate as banks borrow. That's
okay, but the bank wouldn't switch from being bank dependent, sorry, a firm wouldn't switch from being bank dependent to bank non-dependent? No.
No, the firm would also, if it's bank independent, it will always fund itself
okay,
from the households, because that's way cheaper. So the constraint in the model, what's going on essentially, the households that own the banks, it's just because of the constraint on the bank side, that's where the whole constraint is. If you can get around it, it's always improving things. If you can also redistribute wealth away from the households, which own the banks, just put it into the banks and relax the constraints, that always helps in this framework. So that's essentially key here.
Any more questions?
Good for now.
Thanks everyone for joining. Let me still announce the next month's webinar, which will be given by Gauti and very related to Markus's talk. Gauti will present our negative nominal interest rates expansionary.